I knew something was wrong when my irrigation system stopped working during the critical growing season. What I didn't expect was to find a trenching machine cutting through my family's century-old vineyard at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The woman directing this destruction, the infamous HOA president, who'd been trying to get her hands on our land for years, but she had no idea who she was messing with, or that her actions would soon turn her perfect little suburban streets into something from a swamp monster movie. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this revenge story gets juicy. I still remember standing there in my work boots, coffee mug in hand, wondering if I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. The Rossi Vineyard had been in my family since 1923, passed down through 3 generations before landing in my hands. I'd given up a promising civil engineering career to preserve our legacy, pouring my heart and soul into these vines that produced some of the region's most acclaimed wines. And now, some power-hungry HOA president was literally cutting through it. "Excuse me, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted over the roar of the machine. The operator killed the engine, and a woman in expensive athleisure wear looked up from her clipboard. She had that Karen haircut, you know the one, and designer sunglasses perched on her head despite the early hour. Victoria Harrington, president of the Estates at Hillcrest Homeowners Association, the exclusive development that had sprung up adjacent to my vineyard a few years back. "Oh, Mr. Rossi, I was going to call you this afternoon. We're implementing some necessary infrastructure improvements," she said with practiced sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "Your outdated irrigation system has been causing water drainage issues for our residents. The HOA board unanimously approved this rerouting project last month." She thrust a folder of papers at me with various official-looking stamps. "All the permits are in order, signed by the City Planning Commission. We have every right to address nuisance irrigation that affects our properties." I flipped through the documents, my blood pressure rising with each page. "This is my private property. You can't just dig through it without my consent." I pulled out my phone and started taking photos and videos of the damage. Their trenching had already cut through one of my main irrigation lines, and I could see water pooling in the newly dug ditch. Several rows of my Cabernet vines, some over 60 years old, had been disturbed in the process. Victoria watched me document the damage with a smug smile that made my stomach turn. "Actually, we can. The water rights easement predates your grandfather's purchase of this land. The HOA is simply exercising our legal right to manage watershed concerns. It's all there in the paperwork," she said, gesturing to the folder. "Though between us, this hillside would be much better utilized as prime real estate than this." She waved dismissively at my vineyard hobby farm. "The Estates has been trying to acquire this parcel for development for years. Your grandfather was quite stubborn about it, too." Her smile tightened. "We're planning luxury condos with vineyard-inspired architecture. Quite charming, really. Your family could be generously compensated if you'd be reasonable." I ignored her thinly veiled offer and surveyed the damage. The trenching had been strategically placed to disrupt my main water line during the most critical period of the growing season. Without immediate repairs, at least 20% of my vines would be compromised, potentially dying within days. This wasn't just about water rights. It was a calculated move to force my hand. I took a deep breath, counted to 10, and gave Victoria my most professional smile. "I'll have my lawyer review these immediately. Until then, I want all work stopped on my property." I turned to the machine operator. "Sir, you're trespassing. Please leave now." The operator looked uncertainly between Victoria and me. Victoria stepped forward. "Continue working, Dave. We have all the necessary authorizations." She turned to me with a tight smile. "If you interfere with city-approved infrastructure work, Mr. Rossi, you'll be facing legal action for obstruction. I suggest you consult with your lawyer before making threats." I held my ground, but knew I needed to verify these permits before escalating further. I retreated to my house, immediately calling the city planning office. After navigating their automated system and being placed on hold for 20 minutes, I finally reached someone who could access permit records. "Yes, the water management permit for the estate's expansion was approved last month," the bored-sounding clerk confirmed. Signed by, Councilman Robert Harrington? Robert Harrington, Victoria's husband. That's when I realized this wasn't just about water rights. They were trying to destroy my vineyard from the inside out. After the confrontation with Victoria, I spent the rest of the day researching. The Harringtons had moved to the area about 5 years ago when the estate's development was just breaking ground. Robert had won a city council seat in a low-turnout special election shortly after. Victoria had transitioned from corporate executive to full-time HOA president with alarming zeal. I found dozens of complaints about her on neighborhood forums and review sites. Excessive fines for minor infractions, harassment over holiday decorations, retroactive rule changes targeting specific homeowners. A pattern emerged. Properties that faced Victoria's wrath often ended up on the market within months, usually purchased by shell companies I traced back to Harrington Investment Group. They're systematically forcing people out to consolidate property, I muttered to myself, connecting threads on the makeshift investigation board I'd created. A knock at my door interrupted my research. Thomas Morgan, a retired judge who owned the property adjacent to mine on the opposite side from the estates, stood on my porch holding a bottle of wine. One of mine. "Thought you might need this after this morning," he said, stepping inside. At 67, Thomas had the sharp mind and observant eyes that had made him a formidable presence on the bench. "News travels fast," he added, seeing my surprised expression. "My gardener's cousin operates heavy machinery for the city, said some entitled lady was tearing up the Rossi Vineyard, figured it had to be Victoria Harrington. She's been after your water rights since day one." I poured us each a glass and showed him the permits. Thomas studied them carefully, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. "These permits are for necessary watershed management on HOA common areas, with an addendum for adjacent properties where irrigation systems interface with community drainage infrastructure. Technically legal, but ethically questionable. The language is deliberately vague." He looked up at me, and the fact that her husband signed off on this is a clear conflict of interest, might be grounds for an ethics investigation. "I need to understand what they're planning," I said, pacing my kitchen. "There's an HOA meeting tomorrow night. Think I could get in?" Thomas chuckled. "Not as yourself. Victoria has a security guard check residents' IDs at the door. But as it happens, my nephew is out of town and asked me to proxy vote for him. I could bring a property management consultant without raising eyebrows." He raised his glass. "Time to do some reconnaissance, Michael." The next evening, wearing glasses I didn't need and a sport coat that wasn't my style, I entered the estate's clubhouse as Thomas Morgan's anonymous consultant. The room was filled with about 40 residents seated in neat rows. Victoria stood at a podium bearing the HOA's pretentious crest, with several board members seated behind her. "As you can see from the quarterly landscaping report, our property values have increased 7% since implementing the enhanced common area maintenance program," Victoria was saying, gesturing to a chart. "The additional fees are already paying dividends. We've also made significant progress on the Hillside Watershed Management Project, which will both improve our water conservation metrics and prepare for Phase 3 development." I watched as Victoria masterfully presented half-truths and misleading statistics. When residents raised concerns about increased fees, she had prepared counterarguments that seemed rehearsed. Any serious opposition was quickly labeled as against community interests. The real manipulation became apparent during the new business portion, when a resident complained about receiving a fine for unapproved plantings in her backyard. "The Architectural Review Committee has strict guidelines to maintain our aesthetic standards," Victoria responded smoothly. "However, if you're finding gardening therapeutic, the Community Beautification Committee is looking for volunteers for the common areas. Perhaps you could channel your creativity there." The resident left feeling like she'd been offered a compromise, when in reality Victoria had given no ground and potentially gained free labor. After the meeting, I was examining a large map of the estates displayed in the hallway when someone spoke quietly beside me. "You're Michael Rossi, aren't you?" I turned to find a woman in her mid-30s with a name tag identifying her as Sarah Wells, board secretary. I tensed, preparing to make a quick exit, but she raised her hand slightly. "Don't worry. I'm not going to expose you. I actually want to help." Before I could respond, she continued in a hushed tone. "Victoria's development plans are more extensive than what she revealed tonight. She's trying to acquire all the properties bordering the eastern edge, including your vineyard. I've been documenting her methods since she forced my neighbor out last year over repeated violations that were never properly documented." She glanced around nervously. "I can't talk now, but if you're serious about fighting this, meet me at Riverside Coffee tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll bring evidence." That night I visited my grandmother Alina at her apartment in town. At 72, she had reluctantly stepped away from daily vineyard operations, but remained the keeper of our family history. When I told her about Victoria's incursion, her eyes flashed with familiar fire. "This isn't the first time someone's tried to push us off our land," she said, pulling a worn folder from her bookshelf. "In the 80s, a development company tried to claim our water rights for a golf course. In the 90s, a hotel chain offered to buy us out. Each time they started with infrastructure concerns before showing their real intentions." "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" I asked, flipping through old correspondence and legal documents. Elena shrugged. "We handled it. Your grandfather was stubborn, and I'm worse. The Rossi Vineyard doesn't just produce wine, Michael. It produces fighters." She tapped a letter with a faded letterhead. "This might interest you. Harrington Investment Group made an offer 15 years ago when Robert was just starting in real estate. Your grandfather turned them down flat. Looks like they're still carrying that grudge." The next morning, I found a cease and desist letter taped to my front gate, claiming my vineyard violated multiple HOA covenants regarding agricultural activities in residential zones and demanding immediate compliance with the estate's community standards. This was absurd. My property wasn't even part of their HOA. As I crumpled the notice, I spotted a car driving slowly past my entrance. The driver was taking photos of my property. The psychological warfare had begun. Sarah arrived at Riverside Coffee precisely at 2 p.m., looking over her shoulder before sliding into the booth across from me. She placed a thumb drive on the table and covered it with her hand. "Everything I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria doesn't just want your water rights. She wants your entire property for the estate's expansion. The trenching you discovered is part of a larger plan to make your operation untenable." She slid the thumb drive across to me. "This contains internal HOA documents, including the real development plans, board meeting minutes that never made it into the official records, and emails between Victoria and various contractors. They've been monitoring your vineyard operations for months, documenting anything they could potentially use against you." Sarah took a sip of her coffee. "Victoria has been systematically undermining property owners who stand in her way. Last year, the Wilsons refused to sell their corner lot that Victoria wanted for a new entrance gate. Suddenly, they were getting daily violation notices for everything from improper trash can placement to unapproved window treatments. When they fought back, anonymous complaints to the city resulted in costly inspections. They sold at a loss within 3 months. I studied Sarah, trying to gauge her motivation. "Why are you helping me? You're on the board." She gave a bitter laugh. "I was elected on a platform of transparency. Victoria has managed to neutralize every attempt I've made to implement actual governance reforms. When I threatened to go public with some of her methods, she somehow obtained embarrassing photos of my brother from college and implied that scandals reflect poorly on the entire family. Classic blackmail. I'm not the only board member she's compromised." Sarah leaned forward. "The garden tour is in 2 weeks. It's the HOA's biggest annual event, and Victoria has invited potential investors and political allies. She's planning to showcase the neighborhood and unveil the expansion plans. Your vineyard is marked as future development, the Vineyard Estates at Hillcrest." I felt my jaw tighten. She's already selling something she doesn't own. Exactly. And she's accelerating the timeline because of the upcoming heat wave. Your irrigation issues will be more damaging, and she'll have more leverage. Sarah glanced at her watch. I need to get back. One more thing. Look into Carlos Rodriguez. He's the contractor handling the estate's landscaping and was recently hired to improve their drainage system. Victoria treats him terribly, and he might be willing to help. That afternoon, I reviewed the files Sarah had provided. Victoria's real development plans were ambitious and parasitic. The estate's planned to expand onto my property, marketing luxury homes with authentic vineyard views. Their water management system had indeed been designed to connect directly to my irrigation infrastructure, essentially siphoning my water for their decorative landscaping while leaving my vines to wither. Meanwhile, I'd received notice that the HOA was now issuing daily fines against my property for excess water usage contaminating community streets, a problem they had created by damaging my irrigation system. I needed more intelligence about their infrastructure. Donning work clothes and a utility company cap, I spent the next day walking the estates with a clipboard and measuring tools, looking for all the world like an authorized contractor. No one questioned me as I examined drainage grates, followed water lines, and took photos of their irrigation system. The development's entire water management infrastructure relied on gravity flow from my hillside position, the same position Victoria had dismissively called unusable, except for development. As I was examining a drainage culvert near the community entrance, a pickup truck pulled alongside me. "You must be Michael Rossi," said the driver, a man in his late 30s with weathered hands that spoke of years of outdoor work. "I'm Carlos Rodriguez. Sarah suggested we talk." We met at a construction site where Carlos was overseeing work, away from prying eyes. "Victoria Harrington is the worst client I've ever had," Carlos said bluntly as we looked over drainage plans spread across his truck's hood. "Demands premium results on discount budgets, then blames contractors when corners get cut. She's been squeezing me on the estate's drainage system for months, rejecting necessary upgrades to the subsurface drainage capacity." "So their system is vulnerable?" I asked, studying the plans. Carlos nodded. "The whole neighborhood sits on clay soil with poor drainage. Their system looks good on paper, but it can't handle sustained heavy flow. Victoria rejected my proposal for expanded drainage capacity, saying it was unnecessarily gold-plated. What they installed instead is borderline inadequate for normal conditions, let alone anything unusual." He tapped a series of connection points on the map. "These are the weakest links. If these received sustained higher than normal water pressure," he trailed off, meeting my eyes with understanding. "Just hypothetically, what would happen?" I asked. "Hypothetically? The decorative retention ponds would overflow first. Then the subsurface drainage would back up. With nowhere to go, water would find its own path. Through landscaping, under foundations, into streets, the neighborhood would become a swamp." Carlos rolled up the plans. "Also hypothetically, their system is designed to perform standard maintenance cycles 2 days before their garden tour. Maximum watering to make everything look lush for the big showcase." I extended my hand. "Carlos, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." As I reviewed the security footage from my property that evening, I noticed something peculiar about the trenching pattern. They hadn't just cut through my irrigation. They'd reconnected the main line to feed directly into the estate's landscaping system. These people weren't just stealing my water, they were using my own irrigation system to make their neighborhood look lush while my vineyard withered. With just under 2 weeks until Victoria's big investor showcase, I needed a comprehensive strategy. My engineering background was finally going to pay off in an unexpected way. Spreading the drainage plans, irrigation schematics, and neighborhood maps across my dining room table, I began plotting my counter move. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival. If Victoria succeeded in her development plans, the vineyard my family had nurtured for generations would be bulldozed for McMansions. The plans came together over 3 days of intensive work. Thomas Morgan provided legal guidance, helping me identify actions that would remain within the bounds of the law while delivering maximum impact. Remember, Michael, the goal isn't just to win the battle but to prevent future wars, he counseled, reviewing my plans with his judicial precision. You need documentation of their encroachment and evidence that any consequences were a result of their own actions, not yours. Carlos proved invaluable, sharing detailed knowledge of the estate's infrastructure weaknesses and maintenance schedules. Their entire system relies on predictable water pressure and volume, he explained. Sudden changes in either would overwhelm their limited safeguards. He identified key modification points that would allow me to regain control of my own irrigation system while potentially redirecting excess flow into their inadequate drainage infrastructure. Even better, he agreed to modify his maintenance team's schedule to ensure they would be, coincidentally, unavailable during the upcoming showcase. Sarah continued to feed information from inside the HOA, including security patrol schedules and detailed timelines for the garden tour preparations. Victoria has been obsessing over every detail, she reported during our clandestine meeting in the municipal library's local history room. She's ordered triple watering cycles for the 3 days leading up to the tour. The showcase pavilion will be set up on the main community lawn, the lowest point in their drainage system. For the technical aspects of my plan, I reached out to Jennifer Williams, a local environmental journalist who had previously covered water rights disputes in the region. After hearing my situation, she provided valuable data on the environmental regulations Victoria had potentially violated. Water theft is taken seriously in this state, Jennifer noted, reviewing my evidence, especially when the diverted resources impact agricultural land. That trenching operation alone violated at least 3 watershed protection ordinances. She agreed to document any newsworthy environmental incidents that might occur during the garden tour. With my team assembled and intelligence gathered, I created a detailed 3-phase plan. The first phase involved technical modifications to reclaim control of my water system while appearing to be conducting routine maintenance. The second phase would involve strategic redirection of water flow during the estate's pre-showcase maintenance cycle. The third phase, my contingency plan if Victoria attempted any last-minute aggressive moves, would involve a full legal and media counteroffensive. I began implementation immediately, working mostly at night to avoid detection. Using my engineering knowledge and Carlos's insights, I installed subtle modifications to my irrigation system where it interfaced with the estate's infrastructure. I created hidden valve controls that would allow me to redirect water pressure and flow on command. Most importantly, I installed proper documentation equipment, moisture sensors, pressure gauges, and tamper-evident seals that would prove beyond doubt that any water management issues originated from their unauthorized modifications to my system. Victoria noticed the unusual activity on my property and increased her surveillance. Security patrols from the estates began driving past my entrance every hour. In response, I created several obvious decoy projects, repainting outbuildings, replacing fence posts, performing highly visible maintenance on tractors in my front yard to distract from my real modifications. I even staged loud phone conversations about vineyard improvement projects near my property line when patrols passed. Meanwhile, Victoria escalated her administrative warfare. The HOA filed a preliminary injunction against my vineyard for alleged health violations, claiming that agricultural runoff was contaminating their water features. Thomas helped me prepare a comprehensive response documenting that any contamination had begun precisely when they had tampered with my irrigation system. Through Sarah, we learned that Victoria's husband, Robert, had used his political influence to fast-track construction permits for the Vineyard Estate's expansion, scheduled to be announced at the upcoming showcase. The pressure intensified when my grandmother Elena was hospitalized with stress-induced hypertension after receiving threatening letters from the estate's lawyers at her apartment. Visiting her in the hospital, I held her frail hand as she insisted, "Don't you dare back down, Michael. This land isn't just dirt and grapes. It's our family's soul." Her vulnerability strengthened my resolve to end Victoria's reign of terror permanently, not just protect our immediate interests. On the night before Victoria's showcase preparations were set to begin, I made the final adjustments to my modified system. Working by headlamp until 2 a.m., I carefully calibrated pressure regulators, tested control valves, and synchronized timing mechanisms. Everything was in place. Victoria's automated lawn system was scheduled to begin its pre-showcase cycle at 5 a.m., running triple intensity to ensure picture-perfect landscaping for the investors. All I needed was for Victoria to turn on her precious sprinklers, and physics would do the rest. The morning of the showcase dawned bright and mercilessly hot, exactly as the weather forecast had predicted. At 4:30 a.m., I positioned myself in my observation post, a small storage shed near the property line with a clear view of the estate's main lawn. Through binoculars, I could see maintenance staff making final preparations for the day's events. Workers were setting up a large white pavilion tent on the community's central lawn, arranging tables and chairs for what promised to be an elegant reception. Victoria had spared no expense. Floral arrangements were being unloaded, catering trucks were arriving, and a small string quartet was setting up near the decorative pond. At precisely 5 a.m., the estate's automated irrigation system hummed to life. Sprinklers emerged from their underground hideaways throughout the community, beginning to spray water across manicured lawns and ornamental gardens. From my vantage point, everything appeared normal for the first 30 minutes. The system was operating exactly as Victoria had programmed it, tripling the normal water volume to ensure a lush, green backdrop for her investors' showcase. What she didn't know was that my modifications were now controlling where all that water would ultimately flow. By 6 a.m., the first signs of trouble began to appear. Maintenance workers setting up refreshment tables noticed that the ground beneath their feet had become surprisingly soggy. Several stopped to examine soft spots in the lawn, their shoes leaving deep impressions in what should have been firm turf. At 6:30 a.m., Victoria arrived to oversee final preparations, dressed immaculately in a white pantsuit that would prove an unfortunate choice. I watched through my binoculars as she barked orders at workers, gesturing emphatically toward areas that weren't meeting her standards. At 7 a.m., Victoria noticed the first visible puddles forming on the lawn. She frowned, marching over to a maintenance worker and pointing at the soggy ground. I couldn't hear their conversation, but her body language suggested irritation rather than concern. The worker shrugged, likely explaining that the irrigation system was simply following her orders for intensive pre-event watering. Victoria checked her watch, apparently calculating that the sprinklers would shut off soon and the hot sun would dry everything before guests arrived at noon. She was wrong on both counts. By 8 a.m., the scheduled watering cycle should have ended, but didn't. My modifications had locked the system into a continuous cycle, and Victoria's override codes no longer worked. Workers were now struggling to place chairs on the increasingly sodden lawn, the legs sinking into the soft ground. Victoria was on her phone, presumably trying to reach Carlos's maintenance team, who were, as planned, engaged in an emergency repair across town and unreachable. At 9 a.m., the first major warning sign appeared. Water began visibly pooling around the decorative pond's edges, suggesting the drainage system was no longer keeping up with the influx. Victoria, now noticeably agitated, gathered several HOA board members near the pond's edge, gesturing at the rising water level. I saw Sarah among them, carefully maintaining a concerned expression while secretly documenting everything on her phone. By 10 a.m., with guests due to arrive in just 2 hours, the estates was facing a full-blown crisis. The continuous watering had saturated the ground beyond capacity. The decorative pond had expanded well beyond its ornamental borders. The community's underground reservoir, built without proper permits and with inadequate capacity, had filled completely, forcing water back through the system. Water was now visibly seeping up through the lawn in dozens of locations. Victoria was frantically pressing buttons on the irrigation control panel when the first geyser erupted through their prized community rose garden, spraying mud all over her white pantsuit. The investors who had arrived early stepped back in shock as the second breakthrough occurred right beneath the refreshment table, sending canapes and champagne flutes flying. But this was just the opening act. The main event was scheduled to begin in exactly 7 minutes when the HOA's underground reservoir, the one they'd built without permits, would reach capacity. The transformation of the estates at Hillcrest from prestigious neighborhood to swampland happened with remarkable speed. By 10:30 a.m., the main lawn had become a shallow lake. The white pavilion tent stood like an island in the middle, its sides now draped in quickly gathered plastic sheeting, in a futile attempt to keep the space dry. Early arriving investors stood on the community clubhouse porch, watching in disbelief as the neighborhood's carefully cultivated image quite literally sank before their eyes. Victoria's composure had completely evaporated. Her mud-splattered white pantsuit now resembled a Rorschach test, and her perfectly coiffed hair had collapsed in the humidity. "Someone sabotaged us," she shrieked, pacing the clubhouse porch. "This is deliberate. Call Robert. Call the police. This is that vineyard owner's doing." But even as she made these accusations, she had no proof. My modifications were undetectable without specialized equipment, and everything that was happening could be plausibly attributed to her own decision to triple the watering cycle, combined with the inadequate drainage system she had insisted on installing against professional recommendations. Water continued to find its own level, following the natural contours of the land, which all sloped away from my vineyard and toward the lowest points of the estates. The neighborhood streets began to fill, starting with subtle pools at intersections and progressing to what resembled shallow canals. Residents emerged from their homes in bewilderment, some attempting to create makeshift barriers with sandbags hastily filled from their children's playground areas. Cars parked on the streets were now surrounded by moat-like puddles, and several homeowners were attempting to move vehicles to higher ground, creating a panicked exodus that blocked the main entrance. At 11 a.m., Carlos arrived with his maintenance crew, having finally been reached after multiple frantic calls. Victoria descended upon him like a mud-covered fury. "Fix this now. We have 50 VIP guests arriving in 1 hour. The future of this community depends on this showcase." Carlos surveyed the scene with practiced professional concern that masked his internal satisfaction. "Ma'am, your system is completely overwhelmed. This is exactly the scenario I warned you about when you rejected the expanded drainage capacity proposal. The water has nowhere to go." He gestured to his crew. "We'll try emergency measures, but I need to be clear. This situation resulted from the exact corner cutting you insisted upon." Victoria's face contorted with rage. "Are you blaming me for this disaster? I'll have your contract canceled. I'll make sure you never work in this county again." Her public meltdown was being captured on dozens of cell phones as residents documented the flooding and her reaction. Sarah stood nearby, ostensibly taking notes as board secretary, but actually recording Victoria's unhinged behavior. "Perhaps we should focus on solutions rather than blame," she suggested calmly. "The investors are watching our response." "Solutions? I'll give you a solution," Victoria snapped, her voice carrying across the flooded lawn to the gathered onlookers. "This is what happens when we try to coexist with that eyesore vineyard. If we had been allowed to develop that hillside properly, none of this would be happening." Her public admission of development intentions and implicit acknowledgement of tampering with my irrigation couldn't have been scripted better if I'd written it myself. As Victoria continued her meltdown, Jennifer Williams arrived, press credentials prominently displayed. "I'm covering unusual environmental incidents for the County Chronicle," she explained to the security guard who half-heartedly attempted to stop her. "This appears to be a significant water management failure. I'd like to ask a few questions about the community's drainage permits." The mention of permits caused Victoria to visibly pale beneath her splattered makeup. As if on cue, several residents began loudly questioning why their substantial HOA fees hadn't provided adequate infrastructure. Others demanded to know more about these development plans for that vineyard that Victoria had mentioned. The unity of the HOA was cracking under the pressure of rising water. By noon, the originally scheduled start time for the investors' showcase, The estates had become a parody of its former self. The showcase pavilion stood abandoned in ankle-deep water. The refreshments had been hastily relocated to the clubhouse, which was now overcrowded with disgruntled residents, confused investors, and increasingly concerned city officials who had begun to arrive in response to emergency calls. Several of the property's decorative retention ponds had merged into one large, unplanned lake that now stretched across 3 backyards. Children had begun to float on inflatable pool toys through the neighborhood streets, finding joy in the disaster that their parents couldn't share. The investors, needless to say, were not impressed. I watched from a distance as several men in expensive suits made hasty exits, their luxury vehicles splashing through newly formed puddles. Victoria made desperate attempts to salvage the situation, offering personal tours of dry sections of the neighborhood and promising that this was a once-in-a-lifetime weather anomaly, despite the clear blue skies overhead. Robert Harrington arrived just after 1 p.m., his city councilman composure cracking as he surveyed the damage. His confrontation with Victoria was brief but intense, conducted in furious whispers that nonetheless carried across the water to several observant residents. "You pushed too hard, too fast," he hissed. "I told you we needed to be subtle with the Vineyard situation. Do you have any idea what this does to my re-election campaign?" By mid-afternoon, emergency services had arrived in force. Fire department pumps were deployed to clear water from critical areas. City engineers were examining drainage systems and taking photographs. County environmental inspectors had appeared, clipboards in hand, asking pointed questions about water usage, drainage permits, and recent infrastructure modification. And through it all, Victoria grew increasingly desperate, her carefully constructed image of control washing away with the floodwaters. I might have felt sorry for her if not for what I overheard next. As emergency services worked to mitigate the flooding, I had moved closer, blending in with the crowd of onlookers. Victoria was on her phone, her voice low but intense. "I don't care what it takes. Bulldoze that entire vineyard tonight. Say it's an emergency watershed measure. We need to solve this problem permanently before it destroys everything we've built." The mask had completely slipped, revealing the ruthless developer beneath the HOA president facade. She was willing to destroy my family's legacy out of spite and desperation. It was time for the final phase of my plan. The moment I heard Victoria's desperate plan to bulldoze my vineyard, I activated my contingency measures. First, I called Thomas Morgan, who had already prepared the necessary legal documents. "She's going nuclear," I told him. "Time to launch the counteroffensive." Thomas immediately filed an emergency injunction against the estate's HOA, citing illegal water diversion, property damage, and attempting to release the evidence we had meticulously gathered over the past 2 weeks. Jennifer Williams published a breaking news story on the County Chronicle's website, exclusively "Luxury Development Floods After Alleged Water Rights Violation." The article detailed how the estates had allegedly tampered with historical water rights belonging to a century-old family vineyard, resulting in catastrophic infrastructure failure. By early evening, local TV news vans had joined the emergency vehicles lining the now draining streets of the estates. Sarah called an emergency HOA board meeting, presenting her secretly gathered evidence of Victoria's misconduct. "For the past year, President Harrington has operated this association without proper oversight or transparency," she told the stunned board members. "She has used HOA resources to pursue personal vendettas, violated our bylaws regarding financial disclosures, and now embroiled us in a potential legal nightmare with the Rossi Vineyard." The evidence was damning. Emails showing Victoria's development plans for my property, records of fines issued without proper documentation, and financial irregularities suggesting HOA funds may have been improperly allocated to Harrington Investment Group ventures. While this internal coup unfolded, environmental inspectors had begun a comprehensive investigation of the estate's water management practices, triggered by Jennifer's anonymous tips. They quickly discovered the unauthorized connections to my irrigation system, improper drainage modifications, and several environmental compliance violations. Each discovery brought new citations and potential fines. with the inspectors paying particular attention to the involvement of Councilman Robert Harrington in approving permits that clearly violated county regulations. By nightfall, Victoria was making good on her desperate threat. My security system alerted me to movement at my property line. Heavy machinery was being positioned near my oldest vines. I immediately called the police, Thomas Morgan, and every media contact Jennifer had provided. They're attempting to destroy evidence of their water theft by bulldozing my property, I reported. This appears to be connected to today's flooding at the estates and the ongoing environmental investigation. The response was swift. Police cruisers arrived with lights flashing just as the first bulldozer attempted to cross onto my property. Officers ordered the operation to halt, escorting the confused equipment operators who had been told this was an emergency municipal action back across the property line. News cameras captured it all, creating footage that would dominate local broadcasts for days. Victoria arrived moments later in a mud-spattered luxury SUV, emerging to confront the police officers. "This is a city-authorized emergency watershed management operation," she shouted, waving her phone displaying what appeared to be an email. "These vines are causing critical drainage issues. We have authorization to remove them." The officers looked skeptical, especially when Thomas Morgan stepped forward, introducing himself as a retired judge, representing my interest. "Officers, we have documentation proving that any drainage issues originated when the estates illegally modified Mr. Rossi's irrigation system without proper consent. Furthermore, we have filed an emergency injunction specifically prohibiting any entry onto this property." He handed them official-looking paperwork that had been prepared days ago in anticipation of exactly this scenario. Victoria's face contorted with fury as she realized her last desperate gambit was failing. "This is obstruction. That vineyard is destroying our community." Her composure completely abandoned her as news cameras captured her meltdown. "We've been trying to get rid of this eyesore for years. Do you know what this land is worth to developers? Millions. But these stubborn farmers won't sell." Her unintentional confession of the true motives behind the water diversion and harassment campaign was broadcast live across local news channels, cementing public opinion firmly against her. As Victoria was escorted back to her vehicle by police officers advising her to leave before the situation escalated further, my grandmother Elena arrived. Despite her doctor's orders to rest, she had insisted on coming when she heard about the bulldozers. Standing tall despite her age, she approached the property line where residents of the estates had gathered to watch the confrontation. "This vineyard has survived drought, recession, and far more intimidating developers than you," she announced, her voice carrying surprising strength. "The Rossi family has tended this land for nearly 100 years and will tend it for 100 more." Her dignity, in contrast to Victoria's hysteria, made a powerful impression on everyone present, including several HOA residents who approached her later to apologize for their association's actions. By the following morning, Victoria's reign of terror had effectively ended. The HOA board, led by Sarah, voted to remove her as president, citing actions detrimental to the community and potential liability concerns. Robert Harrington faced an ethics investigation and growing calls for his resignation from the city council. Their development company's stock plummeted as news of the scandal spread, with investors withdrawing support from all Harrington Investment Group projects. The environmental inspector's report was devastating, documenting multiple violations that carried substantial fines. The unauthorized water diversion alone resulted in penalties exceeding $100,000. More significantly, the report mandated a complete overhaul of the estate's water management infrastructure at the HOA's expense to bring it into compliance with county regulation. The estimated cost for these required improvements was nearly $1,500,000, a crushing financial blow to the community that had once looked down on my hobby farm. In a final act of desperation, Victoria returned to my property late that night. My security cameras captured her stumbling through the vineyard with what appeared to be gasoline canisters, heading toward my oldest and most valuable vines. I called the police immediately and drove down to intercept her. When I arrived, she was struggling with the cap of the first canister, muttering incoherently about making it all worthless. The police arrived moments later, catching her in the act of attempted vandalism and possible arson. This time there would be no talking her way out of the consequences. Victoria's arrest for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted arson marked the final chapter in her campaign against my vineyard. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, still wearing designer clothes now stained with gasoline and dirt, was featured prominently in local news reports. The woman who had built her identity around projecting perfection and control had lost everything: her position, her reputation, and soon, her freedom. The district attorney, sensing a high-profile opportunity, pursued charges aggressively, using the extensive documentation we had gathered to build a compelling case about her pattern of harassment and escalating behavior. Robert Harrington fared little better. The ethics investigation revealed that he had used his position on the city council to fast-track permits not just for actions against my vineyard, but for several other Harrington Investment Group projects throughout the county. His attempts to distance himself from Victoria's actions fell flat when investigators uncovered emails in which he had actively advised her on strategies to apply maximum pressure on the vineyard situation. Facing certain recall and possible criminal charges for abuse of office, he resigned from the city council in disgrace. The aftermath brought unexpected healing to the community. Sarah, now serving as interim HOA president, approached me with a proposal. The estate needs to completely rebuild its water management system, she explained during our meeting on my porch where we shared a bottle of my family's wine. We have an opportunity to design something that benefits both properties. Your engineering background could be invaluable in creating a sustainable solution. What began as an adversarial relationship evolved into a collaborative partnership. Working with Carlos and environmental consultants, we designed an integrated water management system that respected the historical water rights of my vineyard while providing sustainable landscaping water for the estates. The section of my vineyard damaged by Victoria's trenching operation was repurposed as a community garden where residents from the estates could learn about sustainable agriculture. My grandmother Elena, recovered from her health scare and energized by our victory, volunteered to teach gardening classes to interested neighbors. Land heals when we heal our relationship with it, she told a group of children planting their first tomato seedlings in soil that had once been the battleground of adult greed. Jennifer Williams wrote a feature article about the transformation titled "From Water Wars to Watershed Moment," documenting how the conflict had ultimately led to environmental improvements and community building. The article highlighted how proper water management benefited both agricultural and residential properties, serving as a case study for other communities facing similar challenges. Jennifer's reporting led to increased scrutiny of development practices throughout the county, with several other questionable projects being halted for review. 6 months after the flooding incident, the estates had transformed in more ways than one. With Sarah's leadership, the HOA rewrote its bylaws to emphasize transparency, environmental responsibility, and good neighbor relations. The oppressive rules and excessive fines that had characterized Victoria's regime were replaced with more reasonable guidelines, developed with actual resident input. Property values, after an initial dip following the scandal, stabilized and began to rise again as the community gained a reputation for innovation and sustainability rather than exclusivity. As for Victoria and Robert, they eventually sold their home in the estates at a significant loss and moved out of state, their dreams of building a development empire in ruins. The legal consequences were substantial. Victoria received probation and community service for the vandalism and trespassing charges, while Robert paid heavy fines for ethics violations. More devastating to them than any legal punishment was the complete destruction of their social standing and credibility in real estate circles. The Harrington Investment Group filed for bankruptcy within a year, unable to recover from the scandal and resulting investor exodus. The first autumn after our victory brought a bountiful harvest to the Rossi vineyard. The season's signature wine, which I named Sweet Justice, earned regional recognition for its exceptional quality. The label featured a subtle irrigation pattern design that those familiar with the story recognized as a nod to our triumph over adversity. During our harvest celebration, which now included many residents from the estates as welcomed guests, I raised a toast to good neighbors and good boundaries. May we always respect both. In a gesture mixing graciousness with just a touch of the petty satisfaction I felt entitled to, I arranged for a bottle of Sweet Justice to be shipped annually to Victoria and Robert's new address, each one bearing a handwritten note, irrigated with care, not malice. I never received acknowledgement of these shipments, but the act of sending them provided a satisfying punctuation to the story. Today, visitors to our region often comment on the harmonious relationship between the historic Rossi Vineyard and the adjacent estates at Hillcrest. Few realize that the charming walking path connecting the properties, the shared water management system that has become a model of sustainability, and the community garden flourishing with seasonal vegetables all grew from an attempted act of destruction. Fewer still know about the emergency irrigation modifications hidden beneath my vineyard, which remain in place, disconnected but maintained, as a silent reminder that preparation is the best defense against those who mistake kindness for weakness. My grandmother Elena, now approaching 80 but still sharp as ever, perhaps summarized it best during a recent family dinner. In winemaking, Michael, sometimes the vines that struggle most against adversity produce the most complex and satisfying flavors. The same is true of people and communities. Raising her glass of Sweet Justice, she added with a wink. And sometimes, when someone tries to flood you out, the best response is to redirect the water and let them swim in their own mistakes. Looking out over the thriving vineyard that will someday pass to the next generation of our family, I can't help but feel grateful for the battle we faced and won. The Rossi Vineyard doesn't just produce award-winning wines, it produces fighters, and sometimes, when pushed too far, engineers who know exactly how water flows downhill.